Hey, Forest Hills. I hope that wherever you are and whatever you're doing this week, this day, that you're feeling a sense of God's presence, God's hope and peace with you. I've been feeling a lot of hope, and part of it has come from the nature of the scripture that I've been reading and the Bible stories that I've been reading. It's a really common mistake, I think, that when we sit down to read the Bible, a lot of times we think that the Bible is giving us information about history. It's giving us facts about the universe or moral lessons from life or some other kinds of truth like that. And the Bible does give us all of those things, but that's not primarily what Scripture is. Scripture is primarily a story. But here's the thing. The Scripture is ultimately a story about God's people, how God's people lived in the past, how God's people will be brought home in the end. What that means is that our stories, your story, my story, our lives together, they're all located inside this story that Scripture tells, because we're all God's people. Scripture is your story. Scripture is my story. Scripture is our story. And when you think of Scripture that way, it's a tremendously helpful and comforting perspective. When you read the Bible, you're not trying to figure out how what you read fits into your life, or how it fits into your work, or how it speaks into your anxiety. That's completely backwards. You don't have to figure out how Scripture fits into a larger story because there's not a larger story. The challenge instead is to figure out how your life, or the news you see on TV, or your worry and anxiety, how it fits into Scripture. Because Scripture is really the only story that there is. All the other true stories in the world are a part of Scripture's story. There's a scholar named Robert Jensen who had a wonderful analogy that compared Scripture and our place in the Scripture to being like a play in the theater. Jensen said it's like we're characters in a play, but we're special kinds of characters who are sort of self-aware, and we know that we're inside the play. Jensen said maybe this play has 3 acts. And we as characters, we know that the first 2 acts have already been written. We know what's happened in them, but we don't know what's going to happen in Act 3. What we know is what the author has done in the first 2 acts. And so we have a pretty good guess of where that 3rd act is going to end up. If the story was a murder mystery in the first 2 acts, it's not going to suddenly become a romantic comedy in the 3rd act, right? So our task as characters in this play is to figure out how everything that we see around us, everything in this play, fits into what the author has already done. When I read this story of Scripture, when I look at this play that we're all acting out, what I see is a story of hope. The story of Scripture is a story of a God who has always brought hope, who has birthed hope, nurtured hope, finished hope over and over again. The stories of our past that we see in the Scripture are stories of how God brought hope to completion. And we know that this story of Scripture is going to end with hope. What we don't know exactly is how this 3rd act is going to end up. But we know for sure that there will be hope. Overwhelming, abundant hope for the people who are audacious enough to claim it and live into that hope of the Scripture. Because the story of Scripture, our story as God's people, is a story of hope. So as you read the Scriptures this week, I would encourage you to be comforted by that thought, that what you're reading, your story, is a story of hope.